so much for joining us today here at the Aspen Cyber Summit. I'm Katie Brooks. I serve as Director of Global Cyber Policy here at the Aspen Institute. I'm joined by Kemba, Walden, Sezaneh, Seymour, and Siobhan, Gorman for an excellent conversation where over the next 35 minutes, we're going to talk about a huge topic, which is aggregated cyber risk. Many of us have been tracking this for years with fears of large-scale disruptions. This year, though, it entered the public consciousness in a new way when on July 19th, air travel, emergency services, banks, and more were disrupted by a faulty update that was pushed out to operating systems worldwide. Now, this is certainly not the first time that this has happened. There have been industry-specific disruptions impacting everything ranging from car dealerships to pharmacies, healthcare, and more. All of these stem from a single point of failure. These single faults can cascade both vertically and horizontally across the digital ecosystem. So we're going to dive into this today in basically three parts. One is level setting, so what is the problem? Two is how we got here. So what are the benefits and incentives that put us in this position? And what's the problem? So the costs. And then where do we go from here? So to get started, Kemba, this is a pretty complex topic. Most will certainly understand, I think, what we mean when we're talking about monoculture and tech concentration, but I want to make sure we start with a common understanding. So can you describe what we mean in simple terms and how you've seen it actually play out?
Sure. They're simple terms, and they're not words that I've made up myself. You heard the director say some of these words, and so let me repeat what he said. And you'll also find these words in the latest Cyber Safety Review Board report on Storm 0558. So the definition from my perspective are ubiquitous and critical products like operating systems, cloud services, payment systems, which underpin essential services, and the director talked about hospitals, schools, utility providers, that support national security, the foundations of our economy, and public health and safety. So ubiquitous is a word that the director said. So these are ubiquitous products that underpin our essential services. And it's often, we'll get to this in the second part, but it's often created in the cracks. Mergers and acquisitions, large conglomerates coming together, being acquired, being integrated, so that you get bigger and bigger products that underpin services.
Excellent. Thanks. That provides us with a great starting point. So let's dig in a little further. So Sezaneh, are there particular sectors that we need to be more concerned with about this concentration, and why or why not?
Yeah, I think so. So there are some sectors that may be predisposed to concentration risk. And the word risk is going to be doing a lot of heavy lifting today.
Yes.
So in the spirit of Kemba's response, just to define what I mean by that is when I talk about risk, I'm really talking about two things. The first is the potential for an undesirable outcome, and here we're talking about disruptions. And the second is the impact of that disruption, which we measure in terms of variables like financial loss, harm to national security, threats to public health and safety, reputational damage, and so forth. And you'll probably notice that for all of those variables, there is a scale of severity that's worth paying attention to. And there are some sectors that are potentially more likely to have more exposure and have more severe losses associated with the disruption. And I'll just illustrate what I mean with two examples. So first is healthcare. The healthcare sector is highly vertically integrated. So healthcare organizations have made the decision to bring various parts of their supply chain in-house, and they've done that to improve patient care and keep costs lower. At the same time, the healthcare sector is highly specialized, and there are a number of highly specialized vendors and software platforms that service that sector. So when there's a disruption at any point in the healthcare value chain, those can cascade very, very quickly. Whether that disruption, by the way, is caused by a ransomware incident or an IT outage, as we're discussing largely here today. By contrast, you have the manufacturing sector, and the manufacturing sector is highly disaggregated. Traditional manufacturers, in particular, like to outsource all aspects or many aspects of their supply chain, everything from like sourcing raw materials to finishing to design and so forth. At the same time, the manufacturing sector has really embraced standardization and interoperability so that when there is a disruption along their supply chain, they can very quickly pivot and integrate new vendors very fast. And it's that disaggregation and interoperability that makes that sector like a little less exposed to these types of risks. So if I were, a policymaker in this space thinking about critical services, I would be looking for indicators like vertical integration and specialization.
Definitely, and a little later on, we'd love to ask that same question about different sectors on resiliency, so we'll come back to that. So Siobhan, over to you. This issue has obviously been in the headlines a lot recently. I think a lot of our probably non-cyber friends in the room have had a new interest in it, have started asking these questions, but it's actually not new. So what has changed recently that this is hitting the headlines, and how have you seen this problem manifest in the hours and days into crisis management around it?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I mean, definitely not a new issue. I mean, I think actually just the concept of cybersecurity in the cloud was something that was much debated, like, 15 years ago or something like that, and we sort of got past that. But, more and more in terms of how we got here, you are seeing just sort of these business forces that pull networks together, whether it's through, mergers and acquisitions or just wanting efficiencies. That I think that increasingly you're just sort of seeing within companies, you'll have kind of multiple systems that are kind of critical nodes for a whole host of things, right? A whole host of services, things that start to have cascading impacts on a wide set of people. That affects healthcare, it affects your ability to buy a car, it affects, your ability to turn on your computer, it affects a lot of things. And so I think why we are seeing it now is just we're reaching kind of a critical point where those systems are in fact so integrated that you do have just more single points of failure out there. So there's more surface area if there's a technical outage or a cyber attack for something to go wrong and have these kinds of cascading impacts. In terms of kind of the crisis response aspect to it, I think one is preparation is really where you want to be, right? So if you've exercised some of those crisis response muscles, you're going to be able to respond much more quickly and much more effectively in the moment. But sort of, I think appreciating what those cascading impacts are going to be is very hard, but probably the most important thing you can do, because I think that one thing that companies run into is they don't fully appreciate the set of stakeholders who are affected by whatever this incident is, and they're correctly trying to resolve the issue, but they aren't necessarily seeing all of the third and fourth order impacts, and that is actually what ultimately gets companies into trouble, because it's much harder to pull that back when after the cascade sort of starts if you don't take initial measures to try to mitigate it.
Definitely. Well, that provides a great segue into the next part, which is how we got here, so diving in more closely to the costs as well as the incentives that bring us to this point. And so, Kemba, certainly we've talked about a little bit of the cost consolidation or reduction, some of the mergers and acquisitions that bring us here. What are some of the other driving incentives, specifically for the private sector, but then also on the government side?
Okay, so I think as a nation now, we are trending towards the idea that we are shifting cybersecurity risk from consumers to producers, from the small to the big. And that creates efficiencies that's helpful to raise our overall security profile across our digital ecosystem. But with that shift, that lift and shift of risk, as Sezaneh so definitely described it, there is a now heightened responsibility and accountability for those cloud service providers and those payment systems, whatever it is, those enterprises, the federal government. There's a higher level of scrutiny, a higher standard for buying down that risk. So we're shifting risk from those that are under-resourced to buy it down, rural hospitals, and moving it to those that are better resourced to buy it down. So that is the benefit of some of this consolidation, some of this aggregation, is that now we know where to look for the risk and buy it down, and we are going to deploy all of our resources, and by our, I mean the private sector and the government's resources to buy it down. So those are the incentives, those are the benefits. It helps small, medium businesses, it helps individuals, it helps underinvested communities. The downside, though, is that now all that risk is concentrated. And Volt Typhoon and Flex Typhoon know exactly where to go look and attack, right? That is the downside. So there are more there's more light on those that have a higher standard of buying down the risk. And that's where we are, I think, as a nation. That's what we need to figure out together. How do we do that more effectively? And more importantly, how do we do it? How do we make it more defensible, the system, right? And how do we make that system more resilient? I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done there, but that's the cost.
Definitely. And Sezaneh, I want to bring you into this conversation about the split between the private and public sector incentives, where they are now and where they should go from here. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that I have too much to add, frankly, to Kemba's answer. What I would say is just an observation to add, to complement that. At the end of the day, this is really all about trade-offs and managing risk. And where you sit will influence how you view that risk and how you make those trade-offs and the costs that go with them. So if you're sitting in government, at the core of this conversation is the public policy tension between leveraging the societal benefits that come with economies of scale and mitigating the costs of concentration risk. If you're a chief risk officer in a private business, on the other hand, the decisions that you make around concentration risk are going to sound a lot more like what operational efficiencies am I willing to give up for security? What will that cost me? And who makes that trade-offs? Well, it will differ. At businesses, we're talking about boardrooms, et cetera, but really it is about values and trade-offs.
Definitely. And so, Siobhan, we've seen this conversation about the shifting of risk to those that they can hopefully handle it at that enterprise level. Are you finding that many of those folks in those seats are prepared for that shift in risk? Are they doing these contingency planning, business continuity plans, or what's happening on that end for the preparedness piece?
We are seeing increasing attention to planning around how to respond and business continuity, and particularly the intersection of business continuity and cyber crisis response, because obviously ransomware, but a lot of other sort of business continuity issues come up with cybersecurity. So we are seeing increasing attention. I think right now it's still largely from the technical standpoint, which is good, and that's really important. And frankly, just sort of based on some of the recent cyber incidents we've seen, we probably could do even more there, because I feel like more often than not, what you usually hear in terms of like the root cause of an incident, it is an IT professional making a calculated risk, accepting the risk because it was needed for some sort of business purpose. But that's not necessarily a decision that's made at a particularly elevated part of the organization. And so, even the CISO may have no idea that that's what's happening. And certainly people in the C-suite probably don't know. And so these are risk acceptances that are being taken fairly low down in the organization. And I wonder whether it makes sense, to just kind of start elevating that, at least for really truly critical systems, whether it's critical infrastructure or, systems that just have a large number of people, businesses, et cetera, relying on them. I'm sorry, what was the other part of your question? I lost my train of thought. But
no, that was great, and I actually have a follow-up on that. So I've spoken with many CISOs, some of whom are here in the audience. How have you seen organizations successfully shift this from an IT problem to an organization-wide problem and bringing in all those stakeholders that should be a part of the business preparedness planning?
Yeah, no, exactly. And actually, that was probably the second point I was going to make, that for sure it needs to be addressed at the IT level, but I do think that what we are seeing is all of the cascading set of business impacts, right? And so businesses need to be planning both from a governance standpoint, are you really thinking through roles and responsibilities in terms of broader crisis response, business continuity, cyber crisis response, and are you really thinking through the sort of how your broader sort of business is going to interact with any components? Because we see a lot of issues where, either it's like a holding company with subsidiaries or just a sort of more of a federated business organization. They have a really hard time organizing among themselves when a component of the business is affected and there are sort of larger issues at stake than just that component of the business. So I think that kind of thinking through the business-wide implications and then who the stakeholders are on the other side who may be affected by it and how you would reach out to them, connect with them, communicate with them, and help them is really important.
Absolutely. So that, I think, takes a really good organizational lens to it. Sezaneh, would love to go over to you and zoom out to kind of an industry lens. I think in July there was a lot of discussion about what does this mean for the cyber insurance market. So would love to turn to you and hear how you're thinking about that aggregated exposure to risk.
Yeah, sure. So I will sort of start by saying, like, what the insurance sector does is that we, of course, when a business decides to transfer their risk, we will take some of that on board, and it's important for the market to have confidence that we're doing that responsibly and sustainably. If I say one thing about insurance, or if you remember one thing about cyber insurance today, I hope it's this. We do not view our exposure to aggregated digital risk as static, and we take a very dynamic approach to managing it beyond which policies we write. So I'll just take a step back. Digital risk does not behave the way that many other causes of loss in insurance behave, like flood or fire. You can't move your home out of the path of a hurricane, but we do the digital equivalent of that all the time in cyber insurance. So we have an aggregated cyber risk model that takes 48 trillion events a month, and that model gives us insight in real time into which of our policyholders may be affected by an outage or vulnerabilities. And we use that information to work with our policyholders throughout the life of the policy to mitigate that risk. And I'll give you a concrete example. So if right now a vendor discovers a critical vulnerability, it's a known exploited vulnerability, says it issues a release, whatever, we realize it's happening, the first thing that we do is we scan our book of business, we identify the affected policyholders, and we reach out to them very quickly to alert them that they are affected. We also make technical assistance available to help them remediate that risk, thereby reducing the likelihood that they will be breached. And that essentially is the digital equivalent of moving their home out of the path of a hurricane.
Really helpful insight to hear, and certainly interesting to get the dynamic component of that there as well. All right, Kemba, over to you. I want to go back to the role of government in all of this aggregated risk. What role should the government play in managing this for society in general and for their own systems?
I think government is in a unique position to be able to take a look at the entire landscape, much like the insurance market, frankly, but take a look at the entire landscape. Not only the digital infrastructure that the government relies on to deliver public services, but the digital infrastructure of our critical infrastructure owners and operators. And we are able to look beyond borders, and because we have a collaborative nature with many of our near allies and allies, and some of our adversaries, to figure out what's in common. So there are a couple of observations for government. First, government through its regulatory power and authorities, legal authorities, you heard Director Ray, they can go and arrest people and give you the decryption keys. We can regulate so that certain essential services and certain ubiquitous critical providers raise their cybersecurity bar. But also, we can see a lot of technical debt. I know this is not sexy or exciting, but we can see a lot of technical debt, and we can invest in fixing that technical debt so that we can be dynamic and move the house out of the path of the hurricane at any given moment. We can encourage industry and the federal government, those that are more resourced to buy down risk, to make cybersecurity a capital expense rather than operational expense, right? Much like an auto manufacturer will have manufacturing tools that are capital expenses. Your cybersecurity tools should be CapEx, not OpEx. So your IT departments and the things that they use in order to protect the business, because that's, to be clear, that's what they're doing. They're protecting the business by protecting the infrastructure. That should be a capital expense. But those are the ways we can arrest our way out of it. We can help with the infrastructure technical debt, and we can regulate and provide some minimum baseline of cybersecurity across the digital ecosystem.
That's a really helpful overview. And where are you seeing some of these conversations happen operationally across government now? Kind of who has the lead on that? I know it's in a few places.
It's in a few places, and maybe the United States is not the easiest place to figure out who has the lead on that. But I will tell you, just from my experience as the former acting National Cyber Director, there is one of those at a minimum in each country. And so you would ask, why would the National Cyber Director travel so much because there's a national cyber director in Singapore or in Israel or in Nigeria or in Costa Rica and et cetera. And we're all trying to solve similar problems, maybe slightly different contexts, but similar problems across the digital ecosystem. Nate Vick is in the room somewhere. And we have a few international diplomats who are looking at the foreign policy piece of it. And so I think being able to mirror each other's strategies and each other's actions and putting money where our mouths are in each one of these jurisdictions is going to raise the bar for the entire digital ecosystem.
Absolutely.
Did I answer your question?
No, that was
Okay.
perfect. And certainly gets into the component of international coordination on this, which is a key part as well, especially for some of the more global issues that we've seen recently. So I'd love to spend the last few minutes that we have all together speaking about resilience, so getting to a place of optimism before we close. So Sezaneh, I think you and I were speaking recently about kind of different approaches in the immediate moments after a crisis and how different entities may communicate that to end users. So what does success look like for that, even when you're experiencing downtime?
I mean, in the response time, I mean, I would just echo something that Siobhan said earlier. The time to prepare is in advance and to understand. So this is something that we really saw, I think, in July 19. One of the, I thought it was a really instructive event. That sounds awful to say, but it was quite useful because in the United States, what you saw was that within the same sector, multiple businesses that were seemingly dealing with the same challenges had a very different ability to respond in real time with metrics that are clearly very public. And I think what that tells you is a couple of things. The first thing, that some of these organizations were much better at preparing and knew who to contact in the moments internally. And the second thing that I would say is communicating to the public what's happening in real time is quite important. Making it clear, I think we saw a lot of the organizations that were responsible that were clearly pointing back to CrowdStrike for information in real time, and I think that was the right move. So those are the kinds of things that I would think about in terms of communications, and really just the emphasis should be preparing to respond in advance.
Absolutely. And Siobhan, I'd love to go over to you with the same question. What are the ingredients for success when you wake up one day and find out things aren't going as planned?
Yeah. I think that, again, understanding sort of who is affected the most about, through this situation, and trying to communicate to them. Often it's customers, right? So if you're a business that gets hit or you have systems that are down, figuring out how it is that you can communicate to your customers, and also thinking through, again, with some pre-planning, like what are multiple ways that you can do that, right? So if your systems are down, how is it that you can actually reach, and maybe it is publicly, maybe it's through, broadcast television, or maybe it's through social media or something like that. But it's good to know in advance sort of what the game plan is, and sort of plan A, plan B, plan C for reaching, at a minimum, your customers and your employees, right? Because those are gonna be groups that you really do need to reach in a major incident like that. But I think that it really does come back to resiliency, and it is resiliency on the technical side, it's resiliency on the operational side, it's resiliency on sort of the communication side, where you're thinking through, okay, like what's the backup plan? And I think that increasingly, hopefully, especially after a set of instructive sort of incidents that we've seen over the course of the year, I hope that companies, organizations, governments too, are kind of thinking through how is it that we're going to build in a little bit more redundancy into our response process and the whole response process. So it's not just the technical side, but also sort of the more sort of corporate business side of it as well.
Excellent. So I think we actually will have time for one audience question. Kemba, I'll go to you with a final question before we get there, but want to cue that up first. If anyone is interested in asking a question of our panel, please feel free to queue at the microphone here. Few ground rules, please go ahead and state your name and affiliation, and please make sure your question ends in a question. All right. So Kemba, we've talked a little bit about resilience and what that means from kind of immediate first response viewpoint. What does it look like in government, again, when you wake up and see those headlines one day?
So when I wake up and see those headlines now that I'm out of government, I can roll over and go back to sleep, which is nice. So what could be helpful to government, and there are a lot of things that government can do to be helpful to industry, I'm aware, but what could be helpful for government is if that industry or that entity that has the most information about a cyber attack or is the biggest victim of a cyber attack has a decision maker. I know I'm calling the pot calling the kettle black, but a decision maker, right? So that incident responders, whether they're government incident responders, whether they're private sector incident responders, and all of them need a single decision maker. If you are talking to a CISO or a chief security officer, that security officer should be able to pull a business offline without having to call the CEO to talk to the board also. Because time is of the essence. So having a single decision maker, I think, would be something extraordinarily useful to the government. The other piece is, please know who your FBI special agent or your CISA cybersecurity advisor is on the ground and have their cell phone number written down on a piece of paper. Just know who that is well in advance, because as the director said, if you call the FBI immediately, maybe we have a decryptor that, if in a ransomware case, that we can come and supply and deploy. Or if it's CISA, the same thing. But know who that person is at that local level and have that number written down on a piece of paper. Because if your system's compromised, you're not going to get it out of your contacts list. So those are the two things that I think would be extraordinarily helpful to the government. Have a single decision maker that can make business decisions on a dime. Contact your local CISA contact on a piece of paper.
Can I just add one quick thing? I think in terms of one decision maker, I think the single greatest challenge that we see companies going through in a cyber incident is the lack of a crisis captain. And so it's the same kind of thing, but it's the decision maker to speak to the government or other external folks, but also to call shots internally, because companies spin and they lose time and then it can get away from them.
Definitely. I like that term, crisis captain. I don't think I've heard that before, but yeah, single person decision maker to lead folks through the fire. All right, excellent. If you want to queue over at the mic, that would be great.
Virginia Griggs, healthcare IT space. Epic and CERN are now Oracle own healthcare IT. I think it's a huge vulnerability. You all are geniuses. So can you speak to that?
So specifically the healthcare sector?
The
Or?
healthcare, hospital providers, more so than the mental health sector, where most of that's still not fully automated. But the patient medical record, the electronic medical record, where all the patient data resides.
Yeah. So
And during COVID, it was opened up so that we would have access to people's COVID results across the country. So it made it more vulnerable versus HIPAA tried to lock it down.
Got it. So some of those concerns around PII being involved here, does anyone want to take that?
I can,
Please. No.
I can start, but I know you both have a lot to say because of where you sit in the infrastructure. So just I'm an old lawyer. From a lawyer's perspective, we've got HIPAA, which is not about security. But that is what governs a lot of those electronic medical records. And so, unfortunately, from my opinion, we don't have yet the legal framework to address exactly that issue. True story, some of you have heard the story, I'm the black sheep of my family. I'm a lawyer, I come from a family of doctors who run clinics, who rely on medical records in that way, electronic medical records, and it freaks me out. But a lot of these vulnerabilities, and so I'm giving you my assessment more so than an answer. The answer is we need more authority around cybersecurity of healthcare systems. That is my answer from Congress. But these vulnerabilities are illuminated because of all the mergers and acquisitions and aggregation of these different systems coming together and being governed under HIPAA, which is an important law, but not a security law. And so there's a gap there.
I would just add to that, that I think while we wait for Congress to act, which might take a while, you know, companies do have a role to play just sort of in terms of like self-policing their own networks, right? And so identifying, you know, if you do hold a lot of electronic medical records, either because that's your business or your business relies on it, you know, how is it that you are building in both redundancies in terms of making sure that there are other ways to have access to it if certain types of systems go down, as well as sort of additional protections or access controls or whatever else is needed. That I think in cyber, we've often sort of thought about what are the crown jewels, and I think it's not so much the data anymore, it's actually more the systems. And so how is it that you are both protecting and creating resiliency around sort of the really key systems within your company to make sure that you can bounce back as quickly as possible? You'll have to deal with HIPAA, you'll have to deal with all the data pieces, but I think that anything that is blocking kind of critical care to people in some sort of way is going to take precedence over kind of working through what the data notification requirements are, which are obviously important, but it's got a longer tail.
I will just add on, just in the days following Change Healthcare, there were a lot of questions about whether, you know, market concentration, since that's at the top of the panel, like, is that a problem in healthcare? Are oligopolies a problem in healthcare? And I would caution against sort of moving down that line. Really, at the end of the day, oligopolies and the market moves towards concentration for good reason, and there has to be value judgments about whether we accept the risks with that. But large organizations are able to invest heavily in research and development to the benefit of society. They're able to spread fixed costs across a number of stakeholders so that, you know, costs are brought down for many of us. But at the same time, the larger organizations, to your point on data privacy, they become more attractive targets to criminals. So there is a trade-off there, and the question is, are we making the right trade-offs? And if we don't think the private sector is making the right trade-offs on their own, then that's, you know, I know there are a lot of students in here, that's a market failure, right? Like from a policy perspective, you have to step in and regulate or legislate. So that's, you know, I would just keep in mind that we really are talking about trade-offs and value judgments here. And if we as a society don't think that that particular sector is making the right trade-offs, then that's the time for our policy to jump in.
I do think we have to think about that healthcare sector in different ways, because you might have a clinic or a rural healthcare provider whose job it is to provide healthcare services. Get rid of your technical debt.
All right, excellent. Well, with that, thank you three so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. And we'll move on to the next panel. Thank you all.